Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Kyle Dreyfus-Wells, Deputy Director of Watershed Programs for the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jeffrey M Reuter, Special Advisor to the Ohio Sea Grant College Program and the Stone Laboratory at The Ohio State University. Beginning in 2001, the Great Lakes have experienced destructive and toxic algal blooms. By 2009, the blooms became so serious that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration began tracking them via satellite. They have predicted that this year's algae bloom in Lake Erie could rival that of 2011, the most severe bloom on record, putting the lives of fish, livestock, and humans at risk. To many, the proliferation of algae blooms is as destructive to our lake as the Cuyahoga River fires of the 1960s. Toxic algae blooms have several causes, but a large one that increases algae growth is phosphorus, the key ingredient of fertilizers. According to today's speaker, to eliminate toxic algae, we need to reduce the amount of phosphorus permitted in the western basin of Lake Erie by 40%. How we do that is one of the many topics that we'll talk about today. Dr. Reuter is the consummate Lake Erie expert, a native of Willoughby Hills, where he caught his first fish on the Chagrin. I just want to point that out, a wonderful tributary to Lake Erie. He transferred to The Ohio State University in 1969 and began working on Lake Erie in 1971 as a graduate student at Stone Lab, one of the oldest freshwater labs in the country. Dr. Reuter obtained bachelor's and master's degrees in fishery management and a Ph.D. in environmental biology before embarking on a 42-year career at OSU. During that time, Dr. Reuter has witnessed Lake Erie's struggle with industrial pollution and algae. In 1978, he started Ohio Sea Grant, a coastal academic program that focuses on sustainable development, coastal safety, and other coastal hazards. It is one of 33 such programs in the U.S. Beginning in 1987, Dr. Reuter directed 4 OSU programs: the FT Stone Laboratory, the Ohio Sea Grant College Program, the Center for Lake Erie Area Research, and the Great Lakes Aquatic Ecosystem Research Consortium. In these roles, he worked on Lake Erie to combat algal blooms, control invasive species, report on climate change, and reduce chemical and phosphorus pollution. He also aided in the development of more than 20 endowments and supported more than 2,200 students with scholarships, fellowships, and part-time work. He has been the principal investigator on over $50 million in grants and contracts. Dr. Reuter retired earlier this year, but still serves as a special advisor to OSU, and he remains steadfast in his commitment to ensuring the safety and health of Lake Erie for all. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeffrey M Reuter.
Thank you very much, Kyle. Perfect. Thank you very much, Kyle and Dan. What wonderful introduction, and it's a real honor and really a privilege to speak here at the City Club to a group like this. I really consider this the perfect audience in the stance that the City Club has frequently taken on issues, sort of that non-biased, nonpartisan, let's look at this problem and let's figure out the solutions. That's really what we have to do right now. We'll talk about that today, but I think City Club is exactly the right audience to be speaking to. I look around the room. I was actually born in Collinwood. I saw the Collinwood table over there. My parents went to Collinwood High School. I'm on Board of Trustees of Nature Conservancy. I saw a table there, and obviously the Clean Water, or the Cleveland Water Alliance, and that is, incredibly exciting to us. And Brian, you're doing a wonderful job there, and I think it's the kind of program that we should all be getting behind right now. I also saw a table for Hathaway Brown, and you guys bring up some of the best students that we have coming up to the laboratory. Real excited about seeing you out here. So again, this is just an incredible opportunity for me. I'm going to rapidly go through some slides explaining the problem, how to fix it, and some of the challenges that we have. And those challenges, I think, are where a group like this can be most influential. This is going to go pretty fast, It'll take a historical perspective, also bringing us up to date. And I have to correct one thing that Kyle said. As of yesterday, we announced I was doing a congressional briefing in Washington yesterday with Rick Stump from NOAA. And this year's bloom actually surpassed the 2011. What Kyle said was absolutely right. We predicted that this bloom would be the second worst on record. The bloom in 2011 was ranked a 10. We expected this one to be a 9, and it turned out to be a 10.5. So we'll talk about that a little bit also. So we look, first I want to say, you know, this is such an interesting problem for Lake Erie, because when I started working on Lake Erie, this is exactly what we were working on. And historically, Lake Erie, you know, has always had probably the most problems of any of the Great Lakes. It's because of the way we use the lake and the multitude of uses that we put this lake through. Okay, so why do we see this on Lake Erie? One, we're the southernmost, we're also the shallowest. So if you look at the figure there, you can see that the other lakes are all over 750 feet deep, and the deepest spot in Lake Erie is 210 feet. And you should be thinking, if we're the southernmost and the shallowest, then we have to be the warmest, and we are indeed by far. And the watershed around Lake Erie, and this gets back to the watershed programs that are here represented here today, and the importance of focusing on our watersheds, because we solve the problems that we have on Lake Erie through work in the watersheds. You look at the watershed around Lake Erie, and sort of the take-home message here is that we have the most agriculture, the most urban, suburban land, the least forest, and the least wetland. That means that we're going to get more sediment, more nutrients. If we're southernmost, shallowest, warmest, and we get more nutrients, then biologically we have to be the most productive, and by far we are. We always produce more fish than any of the other Great Lakes, and frequently we produce more fish out of Lake Erie than all the other Great Lakes combined. And think of Lake Superior being over 25 times larger in volume than Lake Erie. And Lake Superior produces about 2% of the fish, and Lake Erie produces about 50% of the fish. Historically, coming up here to Cleveland, my first trip on the Cuyahoga River was 1956. For the students in the room, you have no idea the improvements. The last time I was on the Cuyahoga, I was looking at great blue herons. There were deer coming down to the riverbanks. Huge, incredible improvement. Now, there's no way we should be satisfied with where it is. We need to do more, but incredible improvements. We need to celebrate that. This is the only time in my life that I have ever seen this kind of a sign on a river, and that's just, you know, the things that occurred immediately following the burning. This event is why Lake Erie has been called the poster child for pollution problems in the country. Okay, now I'm a grad student at Stone Lab, 1971. This is what my arm looked like in those days, what my hand looked like, and that's what the lake looked like in those days. Notice the color. Okay, this is up at Stone Laboratory, oldest freshwater biological field station in the country. It's where right now we're doing water testing for 7 coastal communities up there, regular courses, workshops, a huge amount of outreach. But the key point here, I'll show a couple other images from this location. About 1 million tourists per year come to this site. So the things that I'm going to show you are experienced, and they impact a lot of people, and quite frankly, they put a lot of people in danger. We call these, I will call these forever, the problem here, blue-green algae. But in reality, more correctly, they are cyanobacteria. When we look at cell structure, look at the cells, and you look at the nucleus of, quote, a blue-green algae, you'll see that there's no membrane around the nucleus. With no membrane around the nucleus, it's really more of a bacteria than algae, but it has chlorophyll. It's green, so it's a cyanobacteria. They like really warm water. Temperatures above 60 degrees, And as Kyle indicated, they need really high concentrations of phosphorus. Nitrogen's also important, but phosphorus is most important. Those preferences tell us where to expect to see these problems as we go around the Great Lakes, as we go around Ohio, as we go around the country, the world. And quite frankly, there are a number of states that are having problems every bit as big as what we're having right now. Huge problems on the Canadian side, and as you go around the world, a number of people have been killed by the toxins that these bacteria are capable of producing. What I've tried to do right here is show you some of those toxins. What I've done is the most toxic things are at the top, the least toxic things are at the bottom. The 4 in red are the primary algal toxins, and if you go about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way down the list, you'll see cyanide. So these things are more toxic than cyanide, which is why it's so important that we work to solve this problem, eliminate the problem. So how do we do this the first time? How do we take that dead lake image, the poster child for pollution problems that I talked about in the 60s and 70s, and turned it into the walleye capital? We did that by reducing the amount of phosphorus going in from 29,000 metric tons down to 11,000 metric tons. I'm a young guy at this point. I look at this. That's a 60% reduction. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking there's no way we do it. But we did. We accomplished it. And the key point here is that in those days, the primary source of the phosphorus was poor sewage treatment. So the huge improvements that have occurred here in Cleveland and at the other sewage treatment plants around the lake is what really solved this the first time. Today, about 2/3 of the load, and when we look at the Maumee River, more than that is coming from non-point source runoff or agricultural runoff. And that means instead of dealing with 20 sewage treatment plants, we're dealing with 15,000 farmers. We target phosphorus because almost always in fresh water, phosphorus is the limiting nutrient. In the Gulf of Mexico or just about anywhere in salt water, we'd be focused on nitrogen. But we recognize that even in fresh water, nitrogen is incredibly important. We should be reducing both phosphorus and nitrogen, and the same is true for the salt water. Now, if we look at the sources, the phosphorus comes from a lot of places. But what we've learned is that when we look at sewage treatment plant and the discharge from sewage treatment plants or the loads from sewage treatment plants, and some of this is just common sense logic. If you think about this, the load from sewage treatment plants doesn't change very much from year to year. And it doesn't change very much during storm events, even with the combined sewer overflows that we have that are a big problem. We're working to solve those. The ultimate load doesn't change too much. We don't flush our toilets more when it's raining than when it's not raining. But in the case of agricultural runoff, the load that comes off agricultural fields is entirely dependent on how much rain you get. When it's not raining, there's nothing coming off an ag field. And when you get a gentle rain, that doesn't have much impact at all. But these storms that produce more than 2 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, those are incredibly important to the loads we get, and those storms are up somewhere between 37% and 53% due to climate change. Most of you probably never seen a slide like this before. This shows how much phosphorus came in out of the major tributaries to the Great Lakes in 2008. 2008 is a base year we often use because it was a wet year across our region. The discharge or rainfall during that year has only been exceeded about 10% of the time during the last 20 years. One of the things that you can see rapidly, and I bet you there are people in the room that have been told or somewhere they've heard that it's the Detroit sewage treatment plant or it's the Detroit River that causes the problem. The load out of the Detroit River in 2008 was 2,000 tons. The load in the Detroit River brings in 80 to 90% of the water coming into the lake. The load out of the Maumee River, which brings in 3 to 4%, but the Maumee River drains 4.2 million acres of agricultural land. The load out of that river was 3,800 tons. Next biggest, if we go across, is the Sandusky River. The Sandusky River drains 1.5 million acres of agricultural land, and you got a load of over 1,100 tons. Now you compare it to the Cuyahoga. Cuyahoga has a rich history, which is due to the burning. It's a very small river. Load out of the Cuyahoga about 450 tons, but still can have an incredibly important impact here in the nearshore areas along Lake Erie. If we look at our lake in cross-section, quickly you'll see that Western Basin's very shallow, average depth 24 feet. Eastern Basin's the deep spot, right about where the B and Eastern Basin's located. And the Central Basin, where we are right now, between Sandusky and Erie, Pennsylvania, average depth 60 feet. You can see the thermocline denoted by the red line there. That cold bottom layer of the lake during the summer beneath the thermocline becomes anoxic or hypoxic, very little or no oxygen. We refer to that as the dead zone. The harmful forms of algae occur in the Western Basin, HABs. In the Eastern Basin, we get excessive growths of cladophora, a bottom algae. In the Central Basin, you get the dead zone. All of that is driven by excessive nutrient loading, primarily phosphorus. New things that we know now that we didn't know. When I took agronomy at Ohio State, in fact, this would have been taught the same in every College of Agriculture, and I went through the College of Agriculture at Ohio State. The same thing would have been taught in every school until about the last 5 years. We were all taught that phosphorus will attach to sediment particles and come off the surface. So to reduce phosphorus loading, we focused on reducing erosion. We were taught that nitrogen would dissolve within the tiles, would dissolve within water and come out through drainage tiles underneath fields. What we know now is about half or more of the dissolved reactive phosphorus leaving our fields is dissolving in the water and coming out through the tiles. Incredibly important, because we focused only on the particulate form of phosphorus in the past. And phosphorus is in two pieces: particulate, sort of attached to the sediment particles, and dissolved in the water. And they're very, very different. Particulate phosphorus is about 25% available for plant use or algae use. The dissolved form of the phosphorus is 100% available. So the changes that we see and the increases in the amount of dissolved phosphorus entering the lake is what's really driving the problem that we see now. Most of our best management practices have focused on the particulate portion. The things I have in red there, these represent opportunities for us to change. So in red, first one, we need to change our best management practices and focus more on dissolved phosphorus. We also know, and this is incredibly important, that when we don't apply too much fertilizer to our fields, that 46 parts per million that you see in the second red line there, that's the maximum amount for maximum crop growth. Anything above that, you don't need. When we don't apply more, the concentration of phosphorus coming out through the tiles under those fields is acceptable. Currently, our guidelines allow animal operations to apply 3 times the amount that is needed. When you apply that much, the amount coming out, the concentration coming out through the tiles is too much. Cover crops is a big guideline, the third one down in red there. We now know that not all cover crops are created, and the cover crops that winter kill, that die during the winter, those are actually bringing dissolved reactive phosphorus to the surface and exacerbating the problem. And we need to eliminate tile risers. Most people in this room, this is not a big agricultural area, not familiar what tile risers are, and essentially in the Maumee River, we have about 800,000 miles of drain tiles to allow us to farm there, and that's about the most intensively farmed section in Ohio, but also parts of Indiana going back to Fort Wayne and up into southern Michigan. If we have a wet spot in our field, what we tend to do is bring the tile right to the surface and create it's like a drain in a bathtub. And that's the way tile risers work. Dissolved reactive phosphorus up about 150%. So the blooms came back in the early 2000s. You see the history of blooms across here. Down near the bottom on the left, you see the giant bloom from 2011. That had been the 10. At that point, that was the 2.5 times worse than any bloom we'd ever seen, and that was the worst bloom in history until this year. But, you know, the more I study Lake Erie, and students will hear this many times from people, and you just won't know that it's true until you go to college and you start working on advanced degrees. The more you learn about anything, the more you realize how little you know and what you don't know. And I'm brought up frequently as this Lake Erie expert, and people think I know everything, and oh my gosh, that is not true. That is just not true. So this year's bloom, worst bloom that we've ever had in history, but this year's bloom was only produced about 1/4 of the toxin that we expected. So why is that? And that's a huge challenge for us to understand right now. So now the arm is older, the watch is better, but this is what Lake Erie looks like in 2010. Different color. This is a different species of algae, but still producing toxins. This is the one we get now. The one from 1971 was a phanoxamenon. This one is microcystis, produces the toxin microcystin. This is that giant bloom from 2011, moved out of the Western Basin in October, and at this point we covered the water intakes for 2.8 million people with a harmful algal bloom producing toxins. This is 2013. This is the bloom this past year. This is the docks up at Stone Laboratory. Some of the students that have been up there may recognize this. And this was just an incredible photo opportunity. This picture was taken by Darren Beatty, a professor over at Kent who was teaching our limnology course. And this was high water level this particular day. This is July 25th, which for the people who frequent Put-in-Bay will mean something to you, because July 25th at Put-in-Bay is the largest tourism day of the year. So this is what the lake looked like when Put-in-Bay received the greatest number of tourists. And July 25th is Christmas in July at Put-in-Bay. High water and the bloom spilling right up onto our docks. Say, what are our goals? So to solve this problem, we need to reduce nutrient loading. If we eliminate the amount of phosphorus coming into the lake or reduce the amount of phosphorus coming in, we'll talk about how much in a second, we don't have harmful algal blooms. We also need to help our water treatment plants, show them how to remove toxins from the water. We need to protect boaters, swimmers, and visitors, and we need to help coastal businesses. A lot of information on this slide. Key points are, I've chaired 2 groups. The first one at the top was the Ohio Phosphorus Task Force. Came out with our report in March of 2013. Recommended a 40% reduction to solve the problem. Later that year, the International Joint Commission, US and Canada, literally took our report word for word and incorporated into that. So now we have not just Ohio, but now US and Canada. Right now I'm the US co-chair of a group that's coming up with target loads for Lake Erie, not just for harmful algal blooms, but also for the dead zone and for Cladophora. We have submitted our report also calling for a 40% reduction. Key differences are, for harmful algal blooms, we need to reduce the spring load of phosphorus by 40%. For the dead zone or anoxia in the Central Basin, the annual load of phosphorus by 40%. But the bottom line is All three groups agree on the amount of the reduction and the targets that we've got. We've identified 14 key tributaries that are the big loaders, the ones where it's worth focusing most attention on. Obviously the Maumee, the Sandusky, and these are tributaries all around Lake Erie, but also the Cuyahoga is one of those. The Chagrin is not one of those. The Chagrin is clearly a priority tributary. I like to call the Chagrin the most important river flowing into Lake Erie. But it's not a big loader of phosphorus. It's a small loader here. Okay, so what does success look like? I don't want people to think that if we hit a 40% reduction, these blooms go away. That would not be true. The challenge with a sewage treatment plant, we can give Kyle, Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, a target on a concentration, and they can hit that concentration, and we can determine accurately a load. Now think about non-point source runoff from agriculture. You can't do that because you're going to get something coming. If it's raining, you're going to get something coming off those fields, no matter what you do on the land. But if we take the appropriate actions, we can greatly reduce that amount. So what I've done here at the top, you see the bloom from 2008, a very wet year. The middle is the bloom from 2011. The bottom is the bloom from 2012. Bottom line is, if we reduce things by 40%, we make the bottom bloom 2012 go away. We take the top bloom and make it look like 2012. We take the middle bloom and make it look like the top bloom. That's what a 40% reduction does. Based on the frequency or the amount of discharge, looking back historically over the last 20 years, we would expect, if we're successful, to produce blooms that look like the bottom one or better 90% of the time. The weakness in that argument is climate change. If we keep getting more and more frequent severe storms and more wet spring periods, we'll see things that are worse, or we'll see blooms worse than 2012 more than 1 year out of 10. Bottom line here, our Sea Grant program, and I see Scott Hardy here, our new extension agent. Scott, give a wave out there from the Cleveland area. Take advantage of Scott. Sea Grant is a real good way, it's a good entree for you to get into everything that happens, not just at Ohio State University, but at all of the academic institutions, not just here in Ohio, but all over the Great Lakes. We've done a lot of research on this. You can go onto the website and you can track down what is currently occurring and what has occurred historically with the results of that. And I encourage you also to come up and visit at Stone Laboratory. Also, an incredible amount of outreach. I don't want to go into all this, but this I speak on this a lot. I think it's incredibly important. But we also try to work through the media, recognizing that, an article in the Plain Dealer, I'm speaking here to 125 people, something like this. One good editorial in the Plain Dealer, yesterday's editorial, think how many people read that. And so reaching the media is important. We've done a good job there. We also started in 2010, and this is an important time, started in 2010 working with sewage treatment plant operators and water treatment plant operators. This is a water treatment plant operator workshop, teaching them first how to identify harmful forms of algae and then how to remove the toxins. This outreach, that work with water treatment plants, has had an incredibly important impact. You look at 2010 across Ohio, this is data from Ohio Department of Health, 49 human illnesses attributed to harmful algal blooms, 12 animal deaths. These are pet deaths. And look how that has come down while the severity of the blooms has gone up. That's the importance of spreading the word, helping people understand the significance of this issue. Impacts, very, very significant. Obviously, Toledo water crisis 2014, 400,000 people can't drink the water. But we're sitting in, often up here at the lake, we take for granted how important tourism is to the state. $40 billion industry, all 88 counties, but the 8 counties that border Lake Erie represent almost $13 billion of that impact and 119,500 jobs. Incredibly important. Charter captains, more charter captains. We have walleye capital, most fish, so we have the most charter captains. Their businesses is down 20 to 25%. Ideas, so I focused quite a bit on agriculture, and I can give you ideas and recommendations for agriculture, but there's also things that each of us can do. It'd be great for sewage treatment plants if we followed Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and instead of focusing on a target load of 1 part per million, if we went to 0.05. Northeastern Ohio Regional Sewer District's already really close to that, but that would be a good thing, a good reduction for all of the plants. But think about things that we can all do in our homes, and this is things that I've done up at Stone Laboratory now. Go with low-flow toilets, low-flow shower heads. Why would that be a good idea? The sewage treatment plant, bottom line is, I've done it at my own home. I've reduced my water consumption by 50%. I let the sewage treatment plant do the work for me on reducing the phosphorus. I send less water to the sewage treatment plant. The sewage treatment plant has a target concentration they're allowed to discharge. So they're going to discharge that concentration of phosphorus irregardless of how much water I send them. So if I send them less, if I send them half as much, only half as much phosphorus goes in. Think about the low flow or low phosphorus detergents, and also on our lawn fertilizers, very important. As a result of our work, Scott's Miracle-Gro removed phosphorus from its lawn care products effective January 1st, 2013. So lawn care is really off the table. That's not the source of this problem. But you can still buy lawn care products that have phosphorus in it, so be careful what you purchase and get involved. You think about some of the solutions here. I've given you steps for agriculture to take. How do you get agriculture to take those steps? Is this a voluntary approach? Is it an incentive approach? Is it a regulatory approach? We know the things. If you don't put on too much fertilizer, don't broadcast apply at the surface, incorporate it into the soil. If everybody did that, this problem would go away. But how do you get the groups to comply? Also, an incredibly important, somewhere between 35 and 40% of all the corn produced. So we talk about the importance of producing food, incredibly important. By 2050, we'll have to feed 9 billion people on the planet. But we're using 35 to 40% of our corn for ethanol production. Where's Dan? Make that the focus of your next group. With that, I'm going to stop. Thank you very much.
Now I'll introduce our next speaker who's going to talk about ethanol production. In all seriousness, today we're enjoying a forum featuring Dr. Jeff Reuter, Special Advisor to the Ohio Sea Grant College Program and the Stone Laboratory at The Ohio State University. We encourage you to organize your questions for our speaker now and ask that your questions be brief and to the point. If you're joining us via our webcast and would like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via the web stream provided by our primary media partner, 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, or one of the many other radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Production, distribution, and broadcast of City Club programs are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Be sure to join us on Wednesday, November 18th for a conversation with Jim Robinault. He's a local author, historian, and also a partner at Thompson Hine. He has a new book called January 1973 on the history of the Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade and other events of that formidable month. For more information about our upcoming and past forums, please visit us online at cityclub.org. Today's forum is part of the Year of Clean Water series, sponsored by the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. We thank you very much for your support. Our community partner for today's program is the Clean Water Alliance. We thank you for your assistance today. Additionally, we welcome guests to today's forum at tables hosted by Cleveland State University and the Nature Conservancy. We thank you very much for joining us. Yes, a polite golf applause for all of that. Yes. And we welcome students to today's forum from Collinwood High School, Hathaway Brown, Horizon Science Academy, Notre Dame Cathedral Latin, St. Joseph Academy, and the Whitney M. Young Gifted and Talented Leadership Academy. Student participation is made possible by the Mary Jane Spar and Charles E. Spar Charitable Trust. Could the students please stand to be recognized? Thank you very much for waving. We appreciate that. Now it's time to return to Dr. Reuter for our traditional City Club Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding our microphones today are Content Associate Teddy Eisenberg and Marketing and Outreach Fellow Faye Walker. Our first question, please.
Dr. Reuter, I really want to congratulate you on a very nice talk that you've given, and it really puts things into a good scientific perspective for the solution of these problems. The problem, as I see it, though, is that for this to happen, it has to go through a political context, and that depends upon a social and an economic buy-in. Could you talk about how do we do that, especially in this current age where it seems that often the political framework is disconnected from the social and from the social will?
Dr. Heath, that's an incredibly important question. And again, Dan, keep a note on this because there's your next. Where we are right now within our region, based on the Annex 4 report that we submitted, I'm incredibly comfortable at this point in providing science-based information on what we need to do to solve the problem. As a region right now, we are trying to wrestle with the question that Dr. Heath raised. How do we call these domestic action plans. What has to occur within each of the states and within the province and within the two countries, US and Canada, what has to occur to achieve the target reductions? And that I don't have the answers for. And that's part of the question on an agricultural side. The agricultural community would like to have everything done voluntarily. If you live in the Toledo area, you would like to probably have immediate regulations. We're also looking at incentives. What can we do to encourage, or disincentives? What can we do to discourage people from doing the wrong things? Those are the big questions for all of us right now. And I feel like I've had the easy part. I can say, here's what has to be done, but how do we do it? And I can't answer that one.
First of all, I want to thank you for your over 40 years of service to the lake. I really do appreciate that.
Yeah.
And my question has to do with agriculture in the state of Indiana. I was shocked recently, and I feel ashamed I didn't realize it, but how large a part of the Maumee watershed falls in Indiana. So how much of the phosphorus is coming from Indiana? Indiana wasn't mentioned as one of the states that has bought into the agreements. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, Indiana's a concern, and they were very much involved with our Annex 4, with the group that I was leading, the 25 scientists all around the country. The Indiana people were very involved, and they're very supportive of it. They haven't taken the political step to have their governor, as our governor and the governor of Michigan and the premier of Ontario have done, agree to the 40% reduction, and Michigan, Ohio, and Ontario have actually stated that they will achieve the 40% reduction by 2025 and a 20% reduction by 2020. Indiana has not done that yet. But Indiana, I can attest, is very committed to taking action, and we have a number of Farm Bureau groups from Indiana and farming leaders from Indiana coming to Stone Laboratory to learn more about this. So I expect them to buy into the 40% reduction quite soon. I think what they're really interested in getting is a better number on the amount in tons of the reduction that needs to occur from the state of Indiana, and we're working on getting them that information.
Thank you, Dr. Reuter. Thanks for your talk, and thanks for your commitment to the lake. It's really heartening to see that you're not taking this retirement thing too seriously. And I appreciate Kyle's reference to the Cuyahoga River catching fire, to that toxic algal blooms. When that happened, it was a real call to action, and we saw that's why we have the Clean Water Act. There was a lot of action around federal policy. You also mentioned climate change's role in its exacerbation of the problems that the lake's already seeing, and that even if we do get the reductions, it might not be enough. So I guess I'm curious your perspective on if you see that kind of rally around the lake that we saw back in that time. If not, how can we make that happen? Do you see support for climate policy as well as a solution to addressing lake issues? There's policies at the federal level and at the state level around energy that are happening right now. I'm wondering how we can sort of merge that to really make an impact on the policy arena.
It's a great question, and you should have noticed on the slide that I showed of Stone Laboratory and the laboratory itself, what we've done out there, we try to be an example and show schools, businesses, individuals, the kinds of things they should be doing to address climate change. We've put 90 solar panels now on top of our old sewage treatment plant, on top of the laboratory itself. 95% of all our hot water comes from solar thermal. So we've tried to be a good example in addressing climate change, because you're right, the increased frequency of severe storms is one of the drivers for this. Often when I'm speaking, I'll go through this general discussion, and you think about the preferences for cyanobacteria, warm water, high concentrations of nutrients. So we really have two possible solutions here. One is we make it colder, and the other is we reduce the amount of nutrients going into the lake. I think we should be working on both of those things, but I don't expect us to make it colder real quick. And you're right, it's incredibly frustrating. When you look now, the number is over 97% of the scientists agree that climate change, not just that climate change is occurring, but that humans are a big part of that. But that's often not the way you see it reported. And the challenges in addressing that is a big part of the problem.
Question. So due to us loading the lake with phosphorus over the years, do you foresee an issue with legacy sediments from the phosphorus building up in the sediments causing a problem in the future or hindering our efforts to stop this problem?
That is a incredibly informed question. Essentially, you think about this, and if you look at the load of phosphorus coming into the lake, and I'll use simply the Detroit River load as one, and what we didn't talk about, but the amount of phosphorus leaving the lake at the Niagara River, those two amounts are almost the same. It's about 2,000 tons. So from the Detroit, about 2,000 tons comes in, and at the Niagara, about 2,000 tons goes out. But we also have 3,800 tons coming in from the Maumee and Overall, we have about 11,000 tons coming in. So we have 11,000 tons coming in, 2,000 tons going out. Where's it all going? Into the sediment is a good point. Legacy phosphorus in the sediment of the Central Basin is very, very important. That's one of the drivers for algal production, resuspension of those. When that cold bottom layer becomes anoxic, the phosphorus redissolves in the water. That's very important. In the Western Basin, legacy phosphorus is much less important. But from a loading standpoint, the piece that's often missed and the piece that is most important is legacy phosphorus on the agricultural fields. We have fields in the state, typically where animal operations are, and recognize the algae doesn't care whether the phosphorus comes from manure or commercial fertilizer. And I don't care either. And from a standpoint of agricultural production, I don't care if a farmer is applying manure or commercial fertilizer, as long as they don't apply too much. But we can find fields that have over 1,000 parts per million on them and phosphorus. And you only need 46 for maximum crop production. And once a field gets up that high, that legacy for phosphorus, even if you stop applying any phosphorus, that's going to take a long time to get that down. That's very important.
Thank you, Dr. Reuter, for a really interesting talk. And I'm still trying to understand what is the magnitude of change that farmers would need to make to implement these best management practices to achieve a 40% reduction. Is it a matter of applying a little bit less fertilizer and creating buffer zones around surface water bodies with wetlands, or is it a larger scale change to their agricultural practices?
A couple of ways to answer that. The first thing that we had to do was make sure farmers raise awareness so that they understand it. And you're right, you go to Indiana and there's a big piece of the watershed that's outside of Ohio. And the farther away you get away from Lake Erie, it's not uncommon for people it used to be not uncommon for people not to realize that they were even in the Lake Erie watershed. Or they think that during a storm event, they ask the question, well, how many weeks is it going to take this water that gets into the Maumee River to get out into Lake Erie? And so they think it must take quite a bit of time. Well, during a big storm event, we take water from Fort Wayne, Indiana, out into Lake Erie in about 24 hours. Okay? So it happens pretty darn quick. All right. Now back to the this loading issue and the impact on agriculture. For a farmer who's applying commercial fertilizer, to tell them not to apply too much, that's an easy change. And in fact, what you'll find is there aren't very many farmers who apply too much because it costs them money to do it. For a large animal operation, that's going to be a bigger change and a very challenging change for us to make. Our guidelines have told them that they could apply 150 parts per million. So now to suddenly tell them that you can't apply more than 46 parts per million, so where are they going to go with all of that? And how do they deal with the increased expense to haul it greater distances? When we went to no-till farming, this is one of the big drivers of the issue. We went to no-till farming. We also tended to move toward broadcast application of fertilizer at the surface rather than incorporating it into the soil. We have to get it incorporated into the soil now. There are ways to do that without, or while it's still maintaining a no-till operation. But that's not easy to do. We have through Senate Bill 150 last year and Senate Bill 1 this year in Ohio taken two really important steps. Senate Bill 150 really focused on increasing our understanding and teaching farmers what to do and training them and dealing with certification of the people who are putting fertilizer on the field. Senate Bill 1 sort of eliminated that application on frozen ground, and from one standpoint, non-farmers can look at this and think, why would anybody put fertilizer on frozen ground? The reason that we did that is that we didn't want to compact the soil in a no-till operation. When you compact the soil, you prevent water from infiltrating. So you want to drive heavy equipment without compacting the soil. When should you do that? Well, when the ground's frozen. You don't compact the soil. So moving away and getting toward incorporation and dealing with the change for animal operations, those are not easy steps for farmers to take.
In many parts of the country where water is not so plentiful, they use drip irrigation to make sure that the fertilizer only gets to particular plants. Is there any incentive to encourage the development of drip irrigation in the Western Basin?
No. That's the simple answer, but the question's really a good one. And this is incredibly good for Cleveland Water Alliance, Nature Conservancy, City of Cleveland, incredibly important. You know what? You've probably all heard us say that water's going to be the next oil, and we're closer to that than we've ever been, and we're getting closer all the time. You look at the things that are happening in California right now with incredible water shortages. When we look at water issues nationally, around the world, the big thing on the water issues, you're either concerned with the quantity, yeah, you don't have enough, or you're concerned with the quality. So now let's talk about Cleveland. Some of you have heard me talk about the way the water levels in Lake Erie change. When it's northeast, southwest lie of this lake. So when we get a real strong southwest wind, all the water blows to Buffalo. When we get a real strong northeast wind, all the water blows to Toledo. And we've seen as much as a 14-foot difference in water level between those two during wind events. There are a number of times each year that we walk back and forth from Gibraltar Island on dry land. In Cleveland, you're right at the middle. So the water on the two ends is going up and down. Cleveland is blessed by always having, in fact, I would predict for the future, Cleveland will always have a plentiful supply of water. But the quality of that water is the big challenge for us. And that, first, the fact that we have a huge quantity, a tremendous economic asset for this region. But it's incredibly important for us to focus on that quality.
Hello, Dr. Reuter. Thank you for coming today. And dealing with environmental challenges often requires change, either behavior or change in money, spending money to address the challenges. How quickly we realize a positive reaction to a change often helps us understand how willing we are to change our behavior or to spend the money. How quickly would we realize change in the frequency of harmful algal blooms or other water quality issues in Lake Erie if we implemented some of your recommendations?
Great question. And there's actually a wonderful natural experiment that nature provided for us between 2011 and 2012. 2011, incredibly wet year. And up until this year, and the huge rain events we had during June and July, the load of phosphorus coming into Lake Erie in 2011 had never been exceeded before. So we had the biggest bloom in history. 2012 was a drought year. Without taking any action on our part, the amount of phosphorus going into the lake was reduced by about 90% out of the Maumee River. That resulted in 1 year, going from the worst bloom to what is actually our target bloom, that bloom of 2012. Bottom line is, if we reduce the amount of phosphorus going into the lake, the harmful algal blooms will go away immediately. And that's because the blooms occur in the western basin of the lake, average depth 24 feet. If you look at all of Lake Erie, about 95% of all the water that flows into the lake flows into the western basin. But the western basin is only 5% of the lake's volume. So things in the western basin happen really, really fast. Retention time for water in the whole lake is about 2.6, 2.7 years. Retention time for water in the western basin is 20 to 50 days. You reduce the load, blooms go away. It's that quick. Getting the load down, dealing with the legacy phosphorus on the fields, that's going to take longer. Thank you.
Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a forum with Dr. Jeff Reuter, Special Advisor at the Ohio Sea Grant College Program and the Stone Laboratory of The Ohio State University. Thank you, Dr. Reuter. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.